When the state gets graded, when Vermont gets graded, one of the things, though, that a lot of people point out is that they really don't have a long-term plan in place for funding that you're going to need over the next several years and decades to deal with this.
Yeah, that's definitely been a challenge with the Vermont state legislature this year. They spent a lot of time talking about a plan and how to do that effectively. And my understanding is that they found there different ways to generate funding for implementing the TMDL, none of which will add up to the full amount that they need to each on an annual basis, but it's kind of a diversified portfolio approach. So there's funding that will come from unreturned bottles, your nickel that you get for returning your soda bottle or whatever. All those bottles that aren't returned, the state will use those funds to help pay for clean water, for example. And things like that. So there's, and the state still hasn't approved a budget for this year either. Right. That's a story for somebody else to tell them. But
so their priorities may be elsewhere right now on other things. But at some point, I think a number of people are saying that they've got to come up with a consistent source of funding if you're going to be successul in tackling
so
this.
as you mentioned, you put it very well. It's a grade that the EPA is looking at for the state. How you have the state has their implementation plan, and then also how are they going to pay for that implementation plan. And so they put together a very solid plan, and the EPA has recognized that, acknowledged that, but they do need to figure out how to pay for it.
Has Vermont had to pretty much go it alone for the past several years? Did New York and Quebec step up as far as helping to deal with the phosphorus loading?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Quebec has an agreement with the state of Vermont for Missisquoi Bay. Of course, that's all in either the Quebec watershed or the Vermont watershed. And so they are in the process of renewing that agreement now. I believe it'll be renewed sometime in the next few months. And it'll be updated with the new TMDL for that part of the lake. And so Quebec has been increasing funding for that part of the watershed to do their share as well. And then New York, of course, also has had to do their share to reduce the amount of phosphorus and other pollutants coming into the lake. And actually just yesterday or 2 days ago, Governor Cuomo released a press release announcing their management plans for the harmful algal blooms.
12 lakes across New York, $65 million, and in Lake Champlain down in the Port Henry area, and up on the New York side across from Isle Lamont.
So like from Plattsburgh north, essentially, the Chazy drainage area. They have, from what I recall from the press release, I think it's $500,000 per lake, and I actually don't know if that's for both of the Lake Champlain sites or individually, but that's another tool that the state of New York is using to do their share to reduce phosphorus loading into the lake.
And I think then they'll have grant money available to various programs that to try to come up with some solutions or ways to try to tackle
the
problem.
Looking at the different sectors as well, just like Vermont and Quebec are. They have, all right, what can we do to support agriculture? And what can we do for urban development and forestry as well?
Some of the phosphorus loading comes from sewage, and there are times when there are overflows or spills, and we hear of hundreds of thousands or more gallons of partially treated or untreated sewage getting into the lake. How big of a problem is that as far as pollution problems, and is that something that's being dealt with, or does more attention need to be paid to upgrading wastewater treatment facilities?
Yeah, that's definitely a tricky one. Overall, lake-wide, we are continue to see improvements in the amount of phosphorus that's going into the lake from the wastewater treatment sector. They are all the wastewater treatment facilities are meeting their permitted levels, and each year that we look at them, they are reducing the amount of phosphorus that they're contributing. So they're all well below their permitted levels. The challenge is on these isolated events. When we have the combined sewer overflows, there is a lot of untreated sewage or partially treated sewage that gets delivered to the lake, and
usually during a heavy rainstorm when the treatment plants are overwhelmed.
And or there's an equipment malfunction or something like that occasionally happens as well, unfortunately. But that is what it is, and so there are contaminants that are delivered during those events too, and that, there is phosphorus that goes through the systems and into the lake. From my perspective, I'm actually more concerned about, in those events, about bacteria. You have untreated sewage going into the lake, and that's what closes beaches. When North Beach in Burlington is closed, when it's closed, it's usually because of a CSO event or something with high bacteria. So there's a public health perspective there too that we're concerned about from CSOs. The challenge is that it's very expensive to deal with CSOs and combined sewer overflows. So you have to essentially separate the stormwater system from the sewer system. And in our urban areas like the city of Burlington, that's very expensive. And so the cities and states need to identify ways to do that in a cost-effective way.
Is the phosphorus issue the biggest challenge facing the lake right now?
Yes and no. Phosphorus, my perspective on that, I get asked that question a lot. And my perspective is phosphorus is definitely an issue that we should be concerned about, and we are putting the right amount of attention towards reducing phosphorus pollution into the lake. But it is an element, and we have a finite amount of it here in the watershed. One of the things that we can, so there is an end to it. It's just a matter of when we get to that point. The challenge is, we need to find ways to reduce the amount that we import into the watershed. We're just, every time we buy fertilizer of one form or another, and we're buying it from out of state or out of the region, out of the watershed, we're just adding to our problem. So, finding ways to reuse phosphorus in the watershed will help. But like I said, at some point, the extra phosphorus we can deal with that. It's something that our society needs to accept, is that this is a problem, and we need to do things on the landscape to remove that problem. It can be solved. Invasive species, not so much. When we have a new invasion like spiny waterflea in 2014, that species is essentially here to stay. There's nothing that we can do to control it once it's here, and that's why we are putting a lot of effort into our boat launch steward program, and the state of New York has actually done a great job with expanding their programs as well.
And stewards
reduce our burden on the New York shoreline, because the state has really stepped up their support for those types of programs, and they're just essentially outreach programs on Lake Champlain. We don't have a mandatory boat wash requirement like Lake George does, which has been very successful. But Lake Champlain right now is just it's too large of a system to do something like that. But that has been a very successful program for the basin program over the last 11 years. We've seen an increase in people who use or bring their boats to launches. It's gone up to like something around 80% or so of the people who bring their boats to launches are aware of the importance of cleaning, draining, and drying their gear and boats before launching and retrieving their boats from Lake Champlain and other water bodies, so they don't spread invasive species from one lake to another. And that's really where we need to also be keeping an eye out, is just making sure we don't introduce more species. It will happen, but it's the more we can educate people about the importance of cleaning their gear, the better off we'll be in the long run.
One thing that was a surprise in the report, unexpected, higher mercury levels in fish. Any idea why?
No, that one. So when we wrote the 2015 report, that was a thumbs up, 2 thumbs up trend that we were looking at. The amount of mercury in our sport fish in lake trout and bass and perch was all decreasing. It was improving, headed towards below the threshold that the EPA has set for safe consumption of these species. And we did a study. We supported a study with RPI's Darren Freshwater Institute a couple of years ago. They went out and collected samples from a bunch of different fish across the lake, and the data came back this spring, and we're like, what happened? The fish are all increasing again in mercury. And so we have some work to do to figure out why that is and what's causing that increase again. So that was definitely a disappointment when we took a look at that.
There's been a fair amount of work combating acid rain over the past 25, 30 years.
Yes.
Are the concerns that with environmental regulations being scaled back, that we're seeing more mercury in the atmosphere arriving and ending up in the fish?
Yeah, there is definitely that concern. But so these samples were collected in 2016, maybe a few in 2017. So that was all before these regulations were scaled back. It certainly could not help the case. The next time we do this assessment, which we do it every 4 or 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised actually to see that trend continue to increase, the amount of mercury in these fish.
Some of the scientists have also raised concerns about microplastics getting into Lake Champlain and finding some evidence of it. There was a lot of concern over the little beads that were in the healthcare products for a number of years. They've been banned, microbeads, but also other types of little shreds of plastic that can come off fleece and other clothing that we wear today that go right through the washing machine, right through the treatment plant, and are ending up in the lake. Is that on people's radar, that may be a threat very soon, if not already?
Yeah, so there's microfibers, microplastics is kind of like the big general term for it, and that's from any plastic material that breaks down. As you mentioned, the things that go through your washing machine, right through the wastewater treatment systems, they weren't designed to handle things that small. Initially wastewater treatment systems were designed to remove bacteria, and then now we're adding tertiary treatment to reduce phosphorus, but they still don't have a way to really effectively manage microplastics and microfibers. Then we have these things called nurdles. Always a fun word to say. Nurdles are the base plastic that's used to create other plastics or fleece fibers and so forth. And those, we see a lot of microplastics in the lake, and we're fortunate in that the long-term monitoring program on Lake Champlain has been running since since the early 1990s, and the crew here at SUNY Plattsburgh has actually kept water samples since the beginning of the program. And so the researchers at SUNY have been able to actually go back to those samples and document an increase in microplastics from the early 1990s right on through today. So that we don't really get into that story too much in the hard copy of the report, but we hope to augment the hard copy with extra content on our website over the next half year or so, 6 or 8 months or so, and that's a story that I'd really like to expand on.